Returning production updates, plus running back talk and other news and notes across college football after the stinger. Hello and welcome to episode 44 of Good Morning College Football. I'm Nicholas Ian Allen of CFB Winning Edge and CampusToCanton.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the Campus to Canton YouTube channel. Please give this video a like. It helps to keep this show growing, helps honestly to keep it going, but also perhaps maybe expanding at some point. We'll see. No promises, but the best way to continue to grow our show and what we're able to offer is to make sure that you are subscribed, make sure that you are rating and reviewing when possible. But on that note, so this technically isn't a podcast, right? We've had some discussions behind the scenes in the past, and the plan was to keep this as a YouTube exclusive show. But you might have seen that Felix Sharp of CampusToCanton.com recently put out a call on Twitter. He also did it in our Campus to Canton Slack prior to that, sort of setting up a challenge with the podcasts that are part of the Campus to Canton family and on the Campus to Canton YouTube, podcast feed. And the CFB Winning Edge podcast is in the mix. And so certainly would appreciate your support if you would rate and review our show, provide some information, in that review to indicate that you really do enjoy the CFB Winning Edge podcast. But I would love to see if perhaps maybe we get Good Morning College Football as sort of a write-in candidate. So if you are so inclined and want to rate and review the Campus to Canton podcast family and throw in some kind words for our show here, who knows? Maybe the powers that be might let us turn this into a podcast format. I've received some feedback from viewers, from listeners who really would prefer that. I haven't run this by anybody, so again, no promises. Don't know if it'll lead to anything, but if we get a lot of support for folks that are showing up for Good Morning College Football, who knows what could happen. But as always, thank you so much for joining us, for subscribing to that Campus Canton YouTube channel, as I mentioned, and for liking this video. That really does help. But then, of course, thank you so much to those of you who subscribe at CampusToCanton.com. You can join for as little as $2.99 per month, get access to a wide range of information, data, Discord access, tons and tons of stuff. But also, if you want to take a look at everything that we have to offer, which includes some of the work that I work most of my time goes to our CFB Winning Edge databases. That includes our 2024 returning production database, which we'll talk about a little bit later, how it compares to the most recently updated notes from ESPN's Bill Connolly. Also, our 2024 team profiles are now out in the world. They are not perfect. They never are, but still have some work to do on team pages. We continue to update those every day. Projected defensive depth charts in some group of 5 teams are where we have the biggest amount of work to do. But we talked win totals earlier this week. Those are not likely to change very much unless there's some sort of major news as far as an injury or transfer. But generally, unless it's a big quarterback move where there's a significant drop off because somebody isn't going to be available for whatever reason, those projected win totals, those power rankings, power ratings, things like that are most likely to stay very, they're not going to change very much, percentage points here or there. So next up on our to-do list, once we get all of those team profiles in the best shape that they can be, we've got stat projections coming later this month. I don't want to speculate just yet on what day those may be available. Again, we're talking a little bit behind the scenes. There's the potential that they could be available in early July, but we're just going to have to see how the next several weeks shape up. But those full, set up in a very similar way with 135 FBS team pages set up with stat projections, team performance projections, coaching information, all that good stuff. That's the next big and the final big item on the to-do list as far as CFB Winning Edge information goes. So you can access all of that by joining campus2canton.com as a C2C Winning Edge or all 22 member. And on that note, let's transition a little bit and talk returning production updates. Bill Connolly, who has really been basically invented this as a concept, coined the term returning production, has done a ton of research and work over the years to sort of hone this idea. It's become more and more, well, in some ways more and more important because there is so much transition, but in other ways, maybe a little less important because the consistency on a roster from one year to the next, the same number of players, growing together, moving up one year in experience and returning to a team maybe doesn't matter quite as much. I think that's still, I don't know, the jury's still out on that, I guess. We haven't seen this. We don't have a wide or a major sample size as far as teams that are getting a ton of incoming transfers. So that's one of the reasons why we at CFB Winning Edge, and also Bill, of course, does this as well, has adjusted returning production numbers. It's not just raw returning production anymore. It is adjusted for incoming transfers. And I think that, the work that we do at CFB Winning Edge, we certainly take a lot of use Bill's example, and he has been put out the percentages of research that he has done to indicate what stats matter most as far as returning production goes. We've based our percentages, for example, our offensive returning production percentages include 23% of passing yards, 6% of rushing yards, 24% of receiving yards, and 47% of offensive line snaps. Those have been suggested by Bill Connolly in the last couple of years, the work that he has done to continue to hone those percentages. On defense, we use 59% of tackles, 28% of passes defensed. That's pass breakups and interceptions combined, 8% tackles for loss, and 5% pressures. There are some differences if you were to put our returning production 1 through 134, because we do have Kennesaw State included in our returning production database, new Conference USA team. Compare that to Bill's. A lot of them are similar. Might not be exactly the same, percentages, might not be exactly the same order. There are some teams that we'll discuss where there's actually quite a bit of difference between how our calculations and Bill's compare. And I'm not sure exactly the process that is involved in that. My best guess is that, and Bill's written a little bit about some of the changes that he's made as far as FCS numbers go. I believe he said this week that FCS data is sort of discounted 50% in those returning production numbers. We are, I don't know, there definitely is some art and some science combined in our FCS inclusion. Definitely wanted to incorporate FCS numbers at premier positions on the offensive side of the ball. So quarterbacks, wide receivers when we can, running backs when we can. A lot of those guys are included. Offensive line, of course, is a very, very important position and often can fly under the radar. But if you heard those numbers that we mentioned, 47% of offensive line snaps, that's a big chunk of that returning production calculation. So when a team is bringing in an experienced FCS transfer on the offensive line, that's important. And so we do want to incorporate that. That's been a little more difficult for us to do on a grand scale. So it's possible that, some of the teams where Bill maybe has a higher number compared to our lower number, it's possible that maybe he's incorporating some more FCS transfers than we are. It's also possible that his numbers include more players who had stats in 2022 but did not or were very limited in 2023. We've added players like Cam Rising, for example, very important quarterback at Utah, missed the entire 2023 season due to injury, but he's an important piece of that offense. Think that he should be included as part of that returning production calculation. So his 2022 stats are added. Same for Brant Keithy, the star tight end there at Utah. So we do have a relatively small number of players that have those sort of adjustments. It's possible that Bill has more of those than we do. And so that might explain some of the changes as well. One team where you'll see a major difference in where they rank in our returning production database and where they rank in ESPN's database is probably a good example of sometimes it's just difficult to get the most up-to-date information. UCLA, there's a difference in our numbers of 16.3 percentage points and 72 spots in our national ranking. So, it's pretty rare. Most of the top 10 and the bottom 10 are very, very similar. It might actually be the same top 10 teams, just in a little bit of a different order. But, a team that ranks 21st in ESPN's returning production database, or numbers, I should say, comes in at 93rd in ours. And maybe a little bit of an explainer there is UCLA doesn't have a 2024 roster. Most teams, they've gotten quicker and quicker now that so many players are moving in and out prior to spring practice. We're getting more and more 2024 spring rosters than maybe we did in years past. But UCLA, specifically when Chip Kelly was running things, was one of the slowest to update its annual online roster. So we cross-reference our returning production database, our team profiles, with what's officially listed there by the team. It's possible that we're accounting for we move some players on that maybe are coming back. Maybe Bill interpreted some news differently. Maybe he has different sources than we do of information that can confirm some of those things. But regardless, our numbers are not perfect. We try our very best to make them as up to date as possible. We also want to provide you as much information as possible. That's why we've got individual team pages where you can look through and see, okay, it's color coded, this guy's out, this guy's not. And that also allows us to get feedback. We've had incredible support from our members who've caught mistakes. And I think I feel really, really good about where we are right now, in part because we've had some folks who are going in even quicker than we've been able to, make that second or third pass through team rosters or get to that updated spring roster before we were able to, who said, okay, you've got this guy in, this guy needs to be added. So that's been incredibly, incredibly helpful. But long soliloquy there. Let's get dig a little bit more into the numbers. So I wanted to, Bill tweeted out his list of the 134 in ESPN's ratings. Iowa State comes in at number 1 with 86% of their overall returning production back. Stanford is number 2, Oklahoma State number 3, Virginia Tech number 4, Rice number 5, then 6 is Virginia, 7 is Hawaii, 8 is USF, 9 is Iowa, and number 10 is Baylor. Our top 10, very much, the same, almost exactly the same teams. But we've got Iowa State also number 1. We've got Oklahoma State slightly ahead of Stanford, so 2 and 3 in our rankings compared to 3 and 2 for ESPN. Virginia Tech also number 4. We've got Baylor coming in at number 5, and it's possible that Baylor took a little bit of a jump for us because they've added a couple of transfers recently that maybe weren't included in those ESPN numbers. I'm not sure, but Baylor is number 5 in our ratings. They are number 10 in ESPN's, but the percentages are the same. We've got 79.3% for Baylor, and ESPN lists 79% for Baylor. So we're really splitting hairs probably here on some of these teams. We've got Rice in at number 6. Hawaii also is number 7 for us. Virginia, number 8, just a couple of spots lower than ESPN. We've got SMU at 9, and SMU has also added a couple of transfers this week or over the weekend, so it's possible that they moved up a spot or two. In our most up-to-date numbers, we've got Iowa number 10, and then USF, who is 8 for ESPN. They're number 11 for us. So very, very similar top 10. You're not going to see, much difference there. And that top 10 is perhaps the most important group. Top 10% or top 10 overall. Those are the teams that, and this is also relying heavily on work that Bill has done in the past, where these are the teams that we can expect the greatest chance of an improvement on the field. One loss record wise, just overall play, what we call team performance, stats based. How well did this team play on the field? There's some teams who are coming off pretty good seasons already, showed some real positive momentum, maybe some overachieving expectations in Iowa State's case. Oklahoma State, of course, got off to a slow start, but then really ramped up. How are those teams going to compete in a wide open Big 12? I'm very interested. But then, some other teams that were on the, really, really struggled throughout the season last year, like a Stanford, for example. Are we going to see Stanford take a big step forward in the second year of a new coaching staff, but also ranking, in that elite level towards the top of the returning production numbers across the board? So makes things a little trickier because Stanford, of course, is moving conferences, going to have a lot more travel this year than in years past. But still a team, I think, worth watching and definitely an interesting team. Toward the bottom of the ratings, that's also where you see the most, the highest likelihood that a team is going to see a negative, a downgrade in team performance, or the win-loss numbers probably going to fall a bit, at least have the highest likelihood. Certainly not a guarantee, but it's been more often than not that the teams at the extreme high end and the teams at the extreme low end are going to be the ones most impacted. According to ESPN, number 134 in returning production, dead last, and by a pretty big margin, is Air Force. There's I know a couple of Air Force players we talked about in the spring are going to be returning in the fall because of turnback situations. So it's possible, because we actually have Air Force at 133, not 134. It's possible that could explain some of the differences there. Not 100% sure, but for ESPN, Air Force comes in at number 134. ULM is second to last. Ton of turnover there at ULM with a new coaching staff and a lot of players moving in, moving out. Oregon State, similar, a lot of turnover, but the Beavs, of course, highly impacted by the implosion of the Pac-12. We'll talk about their rival and also, I guess, maybe closest ally in some ways. Washington State is our team of the day later on. But Oregon State comes in at 132 at ESPN. Troy is 131. Michigan, 130. Temple, 129. San Jose State, 128. Ohio, 127. Washington is 126. James Madison, 125. And that's the bottom 10 there for ESPN. Ours are similar, as I mentioned, but we actually have Troy coming in as the last place team in returning production. Air Force 133 for us, San Jose State 132, ULM 131, James Madison 130, Washington 129, New Mexico State, which is ESPN's 124 team, they're 128 for us, Temple at 127, and Oregon State at 126, with Michigan at 125. So very, very similar makeup of teams. So again, those extreme ends, not going to change very much. There are some differences there in the middle. I mentioned UCLA as being one of the ones where there's the biggest difference. Coastal Carolina, Utah State, Northwestern, we see a percentage of we have 5% or more higher percentage points in each of those. UCLA, we see, as I mentioned, 16.5 roughly percent lower. We've got Marshall much lower than ESPN does. They're 114th in our ratings. They're 98th in ESPN's. Troy, we've got a little bit of a difference there. Georgia State, we've got a bit of a difference. Massachusetts, South Alabama, Akron, San Jose State, and Tulane, we also all have at least 6 percentage points lower. So if you see something that we've got wrong for any of those teams where there are major differences, please reach out. We're always going through and trying to make sure we've got the most up-to-date information on transfers, guys graduated, guys sometimes fall off the roster, they retire, medically retire, or just move on to life after football somewhat unexpectedly. So we try to catch those best we can. It's possible we caught some that ESPN different. It's definitely possible that ESPN has some taken into account that we haven't yet. So reach out anytime if you see some mistakes on our end. We want to make those as accurate as possible for our subscribers. But one team that of course ranks very highly in both returning production numbers is Virginia Tech, and there was a write-up at ESPN by Harry Lyles Jr. last week, or maybe earlier this week. Days have been kind of blending together, that sort of went in depth on Virginia Tech and sort of the expectations in Blacksburg for a team that really surged at the end of last year. And because they bring back so much, they were able to retain, so many of their key players. Even were able to add some players who were expected to be starters last year but missed time due to injury, in some cases the entire season. Have a quarterback coming back who wasn't the week one starter in Kyron Drones, but helped take that offense to the next level once he had the opportunity to step in and play. Now more comfortable on the team in the offense. Drones was a first-year transfer from Baylor last season, first-time starter at the FBS level, and now is considered by some, maybe a dark horse Heisman candidate. I think we mentioned a month or so ago, Chris Felicia, the Bear, formerly of ESPN, now Fox Sports, had a write-up that included Drones as one of his Heisman bets in the early days of the offseason. So Brent Pry, head coach at Virginia Tech. It's been a little bit of a slow build there, but it seems like things are really, really picking up in momentum. As Lyles outlined, and as we mentioned in the most recent ESPN returning production numbers, the Hokies returned 84%, which is fourth in their ratings for us. Virginia Tech comes in also at number 4 with 83.6%. So it looks like we're definitely on the right or similar numbers there. But Pry gave a little insight on maybe a little bit of the unique situation that Virginia Tech is in, having so many players back. Quoted here in the piece, he says, "We know a lot more about our players on our team right now than we did last year at this time. For years, even as a defensive coordinator, you go down your depth chart and you want to know what you're going to get from a guy when you put him out there. And so we have a lot more guys that have proven and have the experience, have the consistency, the work ethic, the attitude. You kind of know what you're going to get." And Virginia Tech is maybe going to be a little bit of a case study for this new era in college football, because it's one thing to rank really highly in returning production, like I said, bring those same players back. How much does continuity, the actual same makeup of players, how much does that matter? Because there are some teams that rank pretty high in returning production where it's not necessarily the same players. It's quite a lot of incoming transfers who bring with them production, maybe even at a higher level than the players who are returning on the roster or the players who are outgoing, and it can play with those percentages a little bit. It's an inexact science, certainly, but there's something that we can't account for. I mean, I certainly haven't tried to account for just overall consistency on the roster for those things that we can't put a number on, as far as camaraderie in the locker room, or when a quarterback can just look out and almost without signaling or have some sort of quick way to adjust a route for a favorite receiver or something like that maybe there hasn't been the time or the ability to build in things like that with a transfer, whether one or both or transfers in their first year. So I don't know, but Virginia Tech, a team that I think our team strength ratings perhaps are a little bit lower on than most folks in college football. Virginia Tech's in a lot of early preseason top 25s, and Brent Pry mentioned that. I definitely think that Virginia Tech is going to be in the mix for that top tier of the ACC, but they're sort of middle of the pack in our ACC power ratings. They're currently 8th in our ACC power ratings. They're 32nd in our national rankings, but very, very dangerous team, especially when you think about all that continuity coming back, just the overall level of experience. I mean, you look at our projected offensive depth chart, and Drones is a junior, listed as a junior with 2 years of eligibility. There are 2 sophomores who are going to be starters on the offensive line, returning starters, and then everybody else is a senior. All but I think looks like 2 of them, according to our numbers, are in their final year of eligibility. Defense is a very similar story, but with 2 juniors, and then everybody else a senior, the way we list it. So how much does just that age actually matter? How much does that experience, guys in their 4th, 5th, 6th year of college football, how does that play out when you look across the field and there's a team, an opponent that has a lot more transfers, has sophomores, freshmen, maybe they're having to lean on a little bit more. It's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. But a few more notes from the piece from Lyles. Talked about, as I said, Kyron Drones' emergence, the success that Virginia Tech has had recruiting locally and then developing those players, also adding through the transfer portal, bringing in, quote, the right positions to complement that experienced team that's returning. But then also Brent Pry quoted here talking about the slow start in 2023 and then the strong finish and sort of how that has raised expectations. Quote, everybody's working, or excuse me, we had a ton of noise when we're 1-3, right? Everybody bitching, and we talked about ignoring any noise and what mattered. And they did a great job with that. And what we can learn from that, because now there's a lot of noise. Top 25, top 10 quarterback. It's still noise, guys. It didn't mean anything when it was negative. It doesn't really mean anything now. Drones was quoted talking about, as Virginia Tech, of course, has a long history of success, but since Frank Beamer retired, several years ago, they've certainly fallen off as far as national profile and competing for championships, things along those lines. Drones quoted here saying, everybody's working really hard to get Virginia Tech back to where it used to be. We already know where it used to be, and we already know Virginia Tech had down years. Last year was just a step toward where we want to be. This year, we're going to work our hardest to just try to get where we want to be, win the ACC, and get in that playoff. I think that's a reasonable expectation for Virginia Tech. We talked about, how our numbers really like SMU, how we expect Florida State and Clemson and Miami to be in that top tier of ACC challengers. And even though Virginia Tech falls, a tier, or you could argue 2 below in our power ratings, I definitely think that there is the chance that Virginia Tech is going to be one of the ACC championship is probably going to have to run through this Virginia Tech team in some way. So very curious to see how that all shakes out. One final note on Virginia Tech: the Hokies received a commitment from Alabama defensive lineman Curtis Perry on Tuesday. So one of those, right positions, adding some depth on the defensive line is, of course, something that most teams have been trying to do this spring window when it was open a bit earlier. But just want to run down a few other transfer notes as well. On Tuesday, Mississippi State running back Simeon Price committed to Coastal Carolina. Iowa has added a receiver from Northwestern, so 2 incoming Northwestern transfers potentially, going to be contributors in some way for the Hawkeyes this season. Jacob Gill committed to Iowa. At Boise State, there have been a couple of tight end additions. Most recently, Connor Gilbreth committed to the Broncos. Boise State also got a commitment from a Villanova tight end transfer. Earlier this week, Northwestern lost a couple of players, but added an offensive lineman with some experience in Cooper Lovelace, former junior college transfer to USC. Fell out of the rotation a bit last year, but could be a player who breaks into the two deep, maybe even the starting rotation there at Northwestern on the offensive line. Former Auburn wide receiver Javarius Johnson has committed to UCF. UCF has added a lot over the last week or so. A blast from the past, I.G. Hill, former high four star transfer or signee, I should say, from Alabama, was a standout performer in his true freshman spring for the Crimson Tide. Did not translate to an impact that season. Transferred to Texas. Things did not work out there pretty quickly, but an interesting name, one to note. And UCF also added Jacoby Jones as a transfer in that wide receiver group. There's going to be, I think, a lot of opportunity to make an impact. We mentioned Penny Boone in our last show, but UCF has been very, very active adding in the secondary as well. Mac McWilliams, a starter at UAB, was an addition made earlier this week. So UCF, a team that we're going to be following very closely because of how highly they rank in our preseason power ratings. They're certainly trying to fill any hole and add as much depth as possible at a wide range of positions. Mentioned some late Baylor production added to the mix. South Carolina offensive lineman Sidney Fugar transferred committed to the Bears early on. I believe it was Monday after we recorded. And UCLA, one of those teams that we're going to have to see what we're missing, why our numbers are so different from ESPN's. One player that they lost, who was highly experienced, Bruno Fina, starting tackle for the Bruins. He is transferred, committed to Duke. So moving on, a few other notes, and we've spent a little less time on the, here's how the last week of practice has gone, or the last 48 hours in spring practice, because of course those have wrapped up. But because spring practice is now in the rearview mirror, a lot of the sites that do such great work covering these teams, the folks at the On3 team sites, 247, Rivals sites, places like The Athletic, local news coverage is of course very, very important. We're going to have fewer of those just regular updates of this is what happened and how does that impact what we should think about these players as far as depth chart, maybe if you're thinking of it from a CFF lens. But this is the time of year where, okay, now we can take our breath a little bit and sort of, dig into some of these depth chart projections. And a lot of team sites have been rolling those out, position by position or unit by unit. And starting with Michigan, Anthony Broom of the Wolverine had maybe kind of an interesting note. Donovan Edwards, it was a little eyebrow raising. Saw some discussion of it when the EA Sports college football video game cover was put out, and had a dozen or so players that you could tell who they were. But the one sort of front and center was Donovan Edwards. Seemed like a little bit of a curious choice. Edwards struggled a bit last season, of course, was working behind Blake Corum, who was incredibly productive. But Edwards also, big game performer, had 104 yards on just 6 carries, but 2 touchdowns in the national championship game. So he's also someone who's flashed in the past and been very good. Seems like he's set up to be Michigan's primary running back, could potentially be one of the top players at his position in college football. But according to Broom, this Michigan running back situation should be considered, as he says here, quoting from the piece, Mullings, a former linebacker, should essentially be considered a starter heading into the 2024 season. This has the look of another 1A and 1B type setup at Michigan. So most folks kind of wrote off Khalil Mullings, that former linebacker who's been fully at running back now for a couple of years. As Broom said, Michigan, of course, got some big plays from Edwards in that national championship game, but let's not forget that Mullings was actually the first running back off the bench, and he also had a big catch in the Rose Bowl. I think that personally, Edwards certainly has a higher ceiling, has more explosive ability. But just something to note there, folks who are very close to the situation see this a little more as a shared role or co-starters. So maybe that's just how it starts going into the season, and then Edwards' talent sort of wins out, and he gets a little bit more of a heavier workload, and that will pay off in terms of production, on the field, CFF, and things like that. But it's just something to keep in mind as well, that Mullings does seem to be a factor, considered a starter, at least by some folks who are paying very, very close attention. At Kansas State, read a little bit from Kellis Robinett of the Wichita Eagle about new running back Dylan Edwards. And I was on CTN with Jared Palmgren over the weekend. We recorded about a week ago, actually, but I think we very briefly discussed the K-State running back situation. Of course, DJ Giddens is highly sought after for fantasy purposes, had a huge workload last season. And, that Kansas State offensive line was one that we discussed on that show as having a lot of turnover. They do have one of those experienced FCS transfers coming in that is accounted for in our returning production database, but 3 full-time starters are gone, 1 part-time starter also gone. And then Giddens had, 223 carries last season, went for over 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns. And then, the top 2 guys behind him statistically last season, Trayshawn Ward and Anthony Frias, transferred out. So Giddens was basically the only running back coming back with any level of experience. So I think he's, up to maybe a first-round pick in CFF drafts. Certainly, somebody where expectations are high. Kansas State added a transfer recently, just within the last couple of weeks, Dylan Edwards, who emerged as a starter at Colorado as a true freshman. Didn't have great rushing numbers, 321 yards on 76 carries, just 1 touchdown on the ground. Did a little bit more as a receiver, especially that week 1 performance was where a lot of this production came from. But he did have 36 catches for 299 yards and 4 receiving touchdowns for the Buffs last season. But perhaps notable, and a quote from a coach doesn't mean everything, but I sort of threw it out maybe without thinking a little bit, just thinking about their size, thinking about their skill set. But when I was talking to Jared, I said, I'm not saying Dylan Edwards is Deuce Vaughn, but and then of course you can kind of let your mind run wild a little bit there. But I wasn't the only one that was making a similar connection. Chris Kleiman, the head coach of the Wildcats, on Tuesday at a Cat Backer event in Salina, Kansas, according to Robinett, quoted here saying, Dylan wants to be an every down back, and I think he can be as an inside runner, similar to what Deuce was. That's big accolades to put him in that category. But he was the home run hitter that we were looking for and we didn't have. So we're excited about the fact that he's the guy that can take it the distance on a play. So Giddens, more of a pound it, in between the tackles kind of guy. Kleiman thinks that Edwards is going to be able to run between the tackles as well. But his skill set as a receiver, his speed is maybe a little bit, not a huge threat to Giddens' overall ability to produce. But if Edwards scores on a 30-yard touchdown run, Giddens isn't going to score on a 3-yard touchdown run. So, something to just keep in mind there. Could chip away just a little bit. And then, of course, Avery Johnson being a really productive scrambler, runner at the quarterback position as well, and that offensive line with all that turnover that we discussed. So, but when you compare a guy who just committed a few weeks ago, and there's a relationship between Kleiman and Edwards and Kansas State and Avery Johnson that goes back a few years, but that's usually not a comparison that a head coach would make willy-nilly. That's one of the best players in K-State history, especially recent K-State history, and it's easy to sort of squint and see, okay, Edwards similar build, similar skill set. Yeah, maybe he will play or has the ability to step into do some of the things that Deuce Vaughn did. Maybe probably not, I should say, at that level, but just something to note there. Kleiman also said that Edwards, quote, gives us a lot more versatility and a lot more options, but also the fact that he and Giddens are complementary runners, and according to Robinette, Kleiman said that we might see both on the field together at times, and quote, we need both guys, according to Kleiman. Kleiman did, of course, reiterate how good Giddens was. Quote, everybody knows how good of a player that DJ Giddens is. People saw that in the bowl game when NC State knew we were going to run the ball, and the kid still ran for 151 yards. DJ is a difference maker, and I think Dylan is a great complement to him, as well as a really good, talented player in his own right when he's on the field by himself. At Oklahoma, we've got an updated depth chart projection from Tom Green of Sooners Illustrated. Not a lot of surprises, but I did want to point out the running back situation, because though Gavin Sawchuk is listed alone, on that top line as the likely starter, three others are jockeying for position and considered, it seems, potential contributors behind Sawchuk, according to Green. So Caleb Hicks, the redshirt freshman, or Sam Franklin, the incoming transfer from UT Martin, or Javante Barnes, who was kind of this time last year considered maybe right there with Sawchuk as a potential starter for the Sooners. According to Green, what we saw this spring, Gavin Sawchuk, of course, 5 consecutive 100-yard rushing performances at the end of the 2023 season. But the biggest leap forward, it seems like, from spring practice was Caleb Hicks. UT Martin transfer Sam Franklin was listed here as a nice change of pace option situationally. So perhaps not somebody who's going to maybe be that, true number 2, but will be able to carve out a role of some sort as a little bit of a different skill set. He said the biggest question mark is where Barnes fits in. Barnes is recovered, I'm reading here from the piece, recovered from a foot injury that limited him last fall, but he did not see the field during the spring game. It'll be worth tracking throughout the fall, see what the pecking order, how that shakes out. There are also, of course, projections at other positions at wide receiver. Green listed Nick Anderson and spring game star Deion Burks as starters at 2 of the wide receiver positions, Burks being in the slot. But interestingly to me, because Jalil Farouk played one of the higher percentages of snaps of any wide receiver. If you look at our team profiles and you see that Farouk was on the field for the Sooners and well over 90%, that's pretty rare. I mean, there's probably single-digit players across college football. Actually, it's 83.7%. So I might have been a little bit confused there, but that's still a high number. Deion Burks was the guy I was thinking of. He was at 95.2% for Purdue last season, but still, nevertheless, 83%, pretty high. I mean, that's going to be like certainly top 10, maybe even top 5% as far as anybody nationally goes. So Jalil Farouk, being somebody who was on the field that much last season, was listed by Green as an or with Andrell Anthony or Brennan Thompson at the other wide receiver spot. So just keep that in mind. At tight end, Bauer Sharp gets the nod ahead of Jake Roberts. Sharp, of course, was a standout this spring, while Roberts was limited. Sharp being an FCS transfer, Roberts most recently at Baylor, prior to that North Texas. And then the offensive line actually differs quite a bit from what we had in our projected depth chart for the Sooners in our team profiles. That's quite honestly, to me, the most important thing that we're doing here, not just because offensive line is a major area of interest for Oklahoma. It's considered the biggest question mark for the Sooners in their first season in the SEC. But these depth chart projections are very, very useful for getting our team profiles up to date and as close to accurate as possible, especially because of the spring. We see a lot of guys, changing positions, try out maybe they were left guard last season, transfer to, or, transition to right tackle if there's the biggest need there. Just throwing out a random example. But so we won't spend a ton of time talking about exactly that offensive line depth chart, but good to know that folks like Tom Green are paying very close attention and can give us a little more insight that we might have missed from other spring practice reports. At Tennessee, similar write-up from Patrick Brown at GoVols247. The running back situation for Tennessee, not a surprise. Maybe the biggest surprise to me is that Tennessee didn't add through the transfer portal. Thought that Tennessee might be in the mix for Damian Martinez. Turns out that was not the case. But Dylan Sampson is, the projected number one guy for Tennessee this season. But beyond that, it's a little murky, especially following the spring injury of Cam Seldon. Brown mentioned that Sampson is now up to 200 pounds, so has added some weight this season. And reading here from the piece, he's attacked the RB1 role head on, dating back to the Citrus Bowl. His two previous shots at that feature role produced positive results, and the Vols will need him healthy this season. Of course, Seldon was expected to be the top complement, and Seldon's been a favorite of the recruiting team and folks at campus2canton.com. So it was sad news when he went down. It looked like that could impact, his shoulder injury could potentially impact his availability earlier in the season. Says there's uncertainty for his timeline, means the Vols could be leaning on one or more of the three backs with minimal experience early in the season. Those backs are Deshaun Bishop, the redshirt freshman who's listed number 3 in Brown's pecking order. And then there's a 4A, 4B with true freshman Peyton Lewis and sophomore Khalifa Smith. At wide receiver, Brown projects that the starting core group for the Vols is going to be Brew McCoy, Chris Brazel II, the transfer from Tulane, and then top returner Squirrel White. There's a congested group of 6 wideouts listed as either a 2A or a 2B behind that starting trio. Some notes from 3 weeks ago that just sort of got lost in the shuffle as we were finishing up spring game and practice reports, but then also had to step aside to make sure we were able to get those team profiles to a position where we could make them available. Miami of Ohio, Miami University. Brian Miller of the Miami Student had a piece on April 27th following the Redhawks spring practice as it was wrapping up. There are a couple of quotes here from quarterback Brett Gabbert that caught my eye. Quote, "Recovery has been going well since I had surgery in October." You may remember Gabbert had a gruesome looking lower body injury in October. According to Gabbert, it says way ahead of schedule. Just got to keep it that way and try to get ready for the season. Continuing on, he said there was probably a month there where I didn't know if I was going to be able to play college football again, Gabbert said. But at the end of the day, you've just got to have belief and perseverance. So sounds like Gabbert was in good spirits and expected to make a recovery, be the starter for the defending MAC champs. Avion Smith, who stepped in following Gabbert's injury, has since transferred. There's a lot of turnover with Rashad Amos moving on to a Power 5, Power 4 program again. That leaves Kenny Tracy as the leading returning rusher with 250 yards and 2 touchdowns last season. Dylan Downing transferring in from Purdue perhaps is going to challenge 4 carries alongside with Keon Mosey. Downing had 211 yards and a touchdown last season. And then top wideout Gage Laverdane has transferred to South Carolina. He was a first-year transfer last season, had a huge start to the season, kind of trailed off a little bit, but still finished as the team leader in targets with 66, receptions 43, nearly 700 yards, and did have 7 touchdowns. Cade McDonald's the leading returning receiver, but a name that caught my eye in this piece, I had missed it, so we just updated it in our returning production database and our team profiles. Andre Johnson, who didn't play a ton at Arizona State last season, only had 4 catches, 36 yards, and a touchdown, but he and Cameron Perry, who was a transfer from Indiana, there's opportunity because not only is Laverdane gone, Joe Wilkins Jr., the transfer from Notre Dame, is out of eligibility. I think one or both of those, power conference incoming transfers, guys who are seniors, 6-year players, I think both of them, don't be surprised if they emerge among Gabbert's favorite receivers, like Laverdane did quickly early in the season last year. So that will do it for our normal show. And I do want to mention that on Friday, we'll be back on Friday, we will have a look at strength of schedule. There was a tweet that Bud Elliott had yesterday or a couple of days ago about strength of schedule and really kind of got me thinking about how we present it. And, we do it one way. We offer a couple of different looks at strength of schedule, but I thought Bud made some really good points. Of course, Bud Elliott does excellent work at the Cover 3 podcast and 247 Sports, CBS. Really, really smart college football. I mean, everybody knows Bud, right? So don't have to say it too much about it. But he brought up some great points about how road games are major factors and how, especially sort of the makeup sometimes playing your toughest opponent on the road can be a good thing if you're not necessarily competing, not expecting to win that game, but you get a more winnable opponent at home instead. So you have more of an opportunity. It's something, we haven't really made too many adjustments in our numbers for road games versus home games and sort of how that impacts things. We've done mostly just sort of the basic, this is the average, roster strength, the average team strength of the opponent. So I want to dig into it a little bit more, but we'll take a look at our early strength of schedule numbers and then maybe discuss some of the updates that we might be able to make over the next few months as we get closer to the season. But want to finish with our team of the day, which is Washington State. And there were quite a few write-ups from CougFan.com, which of course does an excellent job covering the Cougs. Jamie Vinnick has been hard at work following spring practice there in Pullman, and has had write-ups on how those depth chart projections are shaping up at quarterback, running back, wide receiver. Also put together a great list of, just sort of numerical, how players, little nuggets of information about particular players that I found insightful. But Washington State, the wide receiver group, is one that is really important for CFF purposes. There's been a lot of discussion, I know, in our Discord and our Slack channels at Campus to Canton. But who is going to be, expected to receive such a heavy workload in a, heavy passing offense, what has been a heavy passing offense with offensive coordinator Ben Arbuckle. But specifically the slot position has a strong track record. Who's going to be slotted into that position? Pun somewhat intended, I guess. But there's a lot of players who are sort of making a name for themselves. And in that sort of numerical list that I mentioned, Vinnick wrote, wide receiver, number 0. Tony Freeman, reading here from it, says, has a chance to give WSU what I thought it was getting in DT Sheffield last year. I was very high on DT Sheffield, in part because of a lot of the real positive reports coming out of spring practice. So, when I was doing a lot of drafting this time last year, I had Sheffield in a lot of spots and had, spent some relatively high draft picks on him, and it didn't work out. It started early in the season, but left the team, has since transferred to North Texas. Perhaps he'll have an opportunity there to get back on track. But Tony Freeman, his play this spring, at least in the eyes of some, kind of gives those Sheffield vibes, where he sort of seems like, or as he was billed last year, Sheffield kind of looked like a perfect fit in this offense. Wide receiver number 1, Chris Hudson, transfer from Oregon, had some good moments, but didn't quite have the big play ability of Freeman, according to Finnick. So that is perhaps notable. Those two, whoever emerges there is going to be in a position to probably be targeted quite a lot and have the potential to really, really produce behind the expected top receiver, who's number 2, Kyle Williams. So Williams had some academic things that he had to address that forced him to miss about a week of spring practice, but he was able to get that cleared up. It sounds like is back in the mix. Williams had 842 yards and 6 touchdowns on 61 receptions last season. I think there's a chance that those numbers could go up, especially if the quarterback position works itself out as hoped. But those top 3 receivers in terms of number are going to be major factors. Williams likely the top target, likely the most productive, but Freeman and Hudson kind of working for one of those really, really productive roles, where we thought number 8, Carlos Henderson, might be in that spot. But Henderson described here as a feisty and fiery, as feisty and fiery as he was a year ago, now more refined as a college wide receiver. His hands are better, routes are crisper, and his connection with John Mateer, who has the edge in the quarterback position, was on point all spring, looks poised for a big year. Speaking of Mateer, as Vinnick said, if Washington State was going to play a game this Saturday, Mateer probably would start that game. He showed more of a big play ability this spring than his top challenger, Zach Eckhouse, who's a transfer from Bryant at the FCS level. Eckhouse has a big edge as far as just overall playing experience at the Division I level, but he was a little bit more inconsistent at times. Reading here from that numerical piece, number 4 quarterback Zevi Eckhouse was the more accurate of the 2 competing quarterbacks during the spring, but had some inconsistencies and appears to be a slight number 2 in the QB battle at this point. Doesn't quite have the mobility of John Mateer. And there was another write-up that discussed sort of how the coaching staff sees Mateer's athletic ability, running ability, as a factor in this competition. But can escape the pocket in his own right. As for Mateer, again, reading from that piece, says still the favorite to be the starting QB in our eyes, but definitely has room for improvement. Decision-making has taken a step forward, but that also progressed throughout the spring as he cut down on interceptions. His legs are a major weapon, and above all else, he has the moxie and swagger needed to succeed. So we'll have to make those moxie and swagger adjustments in our team profiles, because quite honestly, on paper, the way we do it, John Mateer is quite a bit lower rated than Zevi Eckhouse. So as a result, because the quarterback position weighs heaviest in things like roster strength and things like our team strength, as a result, Mateer, who was a relatively low-rated player coming out of high school, 82.25 in the 247 Sports Composite, 5.2 Rivals rating, 81.91 in the On3 industry ratings. So those are low 3 stars. I mean, that's basically kind of just above what those generic walk-on ratings would be. So Mateer didn't receive a lot of attention coming out of high school, but has experience in this offense. That gives him a little bit of an edge there. Was able to, he played 6.2 snaps per game last season, 8% of Washington State's overall snaps played in 12 games. So that carries, some weight. There's probably a bit of, comfortability with the coaching staff, because Mateer has been there, has been through all the meetings, been through all the practices. They've seen how he can perform on game day, in a sort of a small role. But Eckhouse comes in. He started 31 games at Bryant. He's been productive as far as adding production points, the way we calculate it for things like 350-yard passing games, for player of the week honors and things like that. Take into account he actually got a bump in his On3 rating because the recruiting sites are doing a great job giving updated ratings for players transferring from the FCS level, or maybe they were an unrated player coming out of high school. So as a result, Eckhouse gets a little bit of a maybe unfair advantage because he's had his rating updated. He's now high 80s in our individual player rating. So his video game rating, better than FBS average, right? John Mateer is low 70s. So if we were to flip these two, our rating on Washington State would change somewhat significantly. And that's maybe a little bit counterintuitive because, at least as of right now, the folks who are on the ground think that Mateer has been the better quarterback. So it's something that we struggle with. It doesn't impact many teams, but Washington State particularly is one of those where sometimes the better quarterback, that isn't reflected in our numbers because we base things on experience and production and past performance, and Mateer just hasn't had as many opportunities. But there are some things, mentioned before, that we've got projected production. That would definitely be something that we'd be looking to add if Mateer is officially going to win this job. But the other thing that I think is important for Washington State, which ranks 111th in defensive returning production, they haven't been quite hit as hard as Oregon State has, with a lot of players leaving to follow Jonathan Smith, and then, of course, on the offensive side of the ball, Damian Martinez ended up in Miami. But there's still, plenty of players who ran out of eligibility or moved on the defensive side of the ball. And that's going to be an impact. But of course, Washington State's in sort of a unique situation where they're playing a primarily Mountain West conference schedule. They are not conference games for the Mountain West specifically, but we treat games when we're doing projected point spreads a little bit differently. A matchup between two power conference opponents gets a little bit of a different calculation than a matchup between a Power 4 and a Group of 5 team. And so Washington State and Oregon State are kind of in this in-between spot. So I'm trying to get a little creative in the way we do our projections. So in those Mountain West matchups, and Washington State, after playing Portland State, the FCS opponent, in week 1, and then Power 4 programs, Texas Tech and in the Apple Cup rival Washington, going to be in September this year in week 3, then it's primarily Mountain West opponents from there on out. In week 13, Washington State plays Oregon State, but all the other games on the schedule are Mountain West opponents. San Jose State in week 4, at Boise State in week 5. They get a week off and then go to Fresno State, home against Hawaii, at San Diego State, then a week off before hosting Utah State, then back-to-back road trips, New Mexico and Oregon State, and then finish with Wyoming at home. But in doing those, as I said, those projections, we didn't want to give a full adjustment as Washington State, considering Washington State like a Power 4 program, because they're, the way the Pac-12 has changed, of course, they're not specifically any longer, but also they don't have the roster strength. They don't have the recruiting ratings that you see from a typical power conference team. Oregon State's in a similar situation. So felt it was worth it to sort of downgrade that Power 4 advantage. I didn't want to pull it all the way down like it was a Group of 5 versus Group of 5 matchup, because I do think Washington State is going to have a little bit of an advantage in a lot of those matchups. But as a result, Washington State is favored in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games according to our numbers. A lot of those, all of them basically against FCS opponents are right around a touchdown. I think Hawaii is the only one that's double digits beyond that Portland State matchup, where we do have Washington State as a big favorite. But we also have the Cougs as similar underdogs of a touchdown or less against teams like Oregon State, Fresno State, Boise State. They're almost double digits on a neutral field. Technically neutral field, though it's in Seattle against Washington. We've got Washington favored by 9 in that one. And then Texas Tech is about a 5.5-point favorite right now. So we project Washington State for roughly 6.5 wins, but it's going to be a very, very unique situation. And quite honestly, I don't have a ton of confidence one way or the other. Washington State getting bowl eligible, yeah, that seems about right. A lot of games that are going to be, within a touchdown, that seems about right. But there are a lot of unknowns, a lot of new opponents playing a Mountain West schedule. So much turnover on the defensive side of the ball. As I said, they rank 111th in returning production. Defensively, top tackler Kyle Thornton is back at linebacker, but then the next 5 are gone, including Jaden Hicks, who left for the NFL. It's going to be a very, very interesting season in Pullman, but they get that quarterback situation figured out. It is an offense that is going to be able to produce quite a lot of passing yards and should pay off for players like Kyle Williams, who was third leading receiver last season, even though I had 842 yards. Lincoln Victor slightly above him. Josh Kelly led the Cougs in yardage and touchdowns, but Williams sticking up, has the look, I think, of a 1,000-yard receiver, and then we'll see how the rest of that group shakes out. The names that we mentioned who don't rank particularly high on this list this year, but seem like they're going to be stepping up for big roles. So that is going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, please do subscribe to the Campus Canton YouTube channel. Please give this video a like. And if you're out there rating and reviewing the C2C podcast feed, would certainly love to hear about the CFB Winning Edge podcast, which will be back in a little over a week. We will be getting our plans together very shortly this week to get back and get back in our normal schedule as we look ahead to previews, but then also, maybe throw in a write-in for Good Morning College Football as well. We'd very much appreciate it. That'll do it, as I said, today. Hope everyone has a great rest of the week. We will see you on Friday for Good Morning College Football. Thanks and take care.